welcome to this episode of CounselTrends. I am Dr. Mercy Connors, and this is Dr. Shannae Anderson, and we are so excited about our topic today because we're going to be talking about empathy, and empathy is such an interesting topic, but let me tell you what the article is. We are reviewing the article, Downsides to the Empathetic Brain, a review of neural correlates of empathy in major depressive disorder. And this comes from Frontiers in Human Sciences in their August 2024 edition. Now, I find this so interesting because as a counselor, we tend to be empathetic people.
Yes.
And so I'm like reading this as, oh, do I have major depressive disorder?
Well, what I thought was interesting is I would have never thought empathy and a major depressive disorder have much interaction. And so
Yes.
that's why this article really caught my mind. I'm like, oh.
Yeah.
And then when I kind of thought about it and read it, I'm like, oh, it totally makes sense.
It does make sense in a lot of ways. So let's start with a definition of empathy.
Yes.
And empathy, the way that I kind of understand empathy is feeling with people.
Yes.
It's really kind of getting into their shoes and seeing it from their perspective. But there are two different types of empathy. So there is the affective empathy.
kind of emotional empathy.
Yes, and I will actually use the definition that they give so that we are all on the same page, which we define as sharing of another's person's emotions, yielding an isomorphic affective state in the observer. So you are seeing the emotion in them and it produces in you. And then there is cognitive empathy.
Yes.
And this is connected to the theory of mind and basically being able to infer and reason about others' beliefs, thoughts, and emotions. So one of the things that they talk about in the article is that there's different parts of the brain
Right.
that do these different things. So to make it really simple, the cognitive empathy happens here in your prefrontal cortex.
It's more of like a higher brain function.
Yes.
Whereas the emotional or affective empathy is more deeper structures of the brain.
Yeah,
which
more
makes sense.
internal.
Yes.
And we would try to show that to you, but that would be hard to show you in the brain where that is. But very deep
More
internally.
limbic system, really
Yes.
kind of center of the brain.
So they talk about, and I find this very interesting because they bring this up in the beginning of the article, that empathy can be a double-edged sword
Yes.
or a risky strength. So what do you think they mean by a double-edged sword and a risky strength?
Well, I don't know about you, but I have always been highly sensitive and very readily can pick up on what other people feel.
Yes.
Almost to the detriment of myself, especially kind of Shannae pre-therapy. I would feel everybody's emotions. I didn't have boundaries.
Yes.
And so I was feeling everything, which has now made me, I think, a great clinician. But at the same time, if I don't have good boundaries and if I haven't worked through my own issues, I'm over-identifying with everybody and I'm
Right.
feeling everything.
Right. And I find this very interesting because I think as a newbie clinician, like I did this a lot where I over-identified it. And there were times that my husband would say, "Why are you so angry?" when I would come home after therapy, after doing therapy. And he eventually picked up on it was after this one client every time. And he's like, "I think you're over," he didn't use empathizing. He used, "I think you're over-identifying with this client." And so it really helped me. That really gave me this kind of concept of, okay, I need to take a step back. Am I over-identifying? Am I feeling with too much to even the detriment of the client?
Exactly.
Because I wasn't able to bring in objective opinions into that situation. So,
and that's why I actually liked this article, is it actually moved into a risk factor
yes.
for major depressive disorder that I had never really considered. And they are basically saying that people who are highly empathic have a greater risk of a major depressive disorder. And so I when I read that, I started cataloging through my mind all my patients that struggle with depression. And I'm thinking of one in particular, and she she just cannot even leave her home. She lives in New York City, and she cannot leave because she sees the homeless people and she sees just all the pain that's going on the streets, that she truly cannot function. She will sit up all night long worrying about all of these issues for other people.
Wow.
And it has caused her to spiral.
Yeah. And I mean, have you suggested her moving?
Right, to get out of it? I know.
But I mean that's one of the things too, is that yes, she's empathizing with these people, but it's to her detriment.
Exactly.
There's nothing, she's not allowing it to motivate her to do something about it.
Right.
She's just sitting and ruminating about it.
Right.
And that makes sense. Like, I can see where, somebody would walk outside and be empathetic, concerned about a homeless person, and then go and, work at a soup kitchen or, do
But
something.
I'm also wondering if that's more of the cognitive
empathy.
empathy.
I think you're right. And I think this has to do with it's very interesting because it gets into the article about actual treatments of MDD. So some of the treatments, as you know, are medications, but there's also deep brain stimulation where they'll actually stimulate different parts of the brain, and that will actually reduce depression symptoms, which is very, very interesting. Maybe we should do a CounselTrends on that sometime. But it's very interesting to see what some of the results are about this effective, not cognitive, effective empathy before they do the treatments and what it is after.
Right.
So a lot of times in these types of research projects, they are showing people things that either somebody in pain or somebody that's not in pain, and what is their different responses, and do they feel that same pain within themselves, and then they do some other different types of ones, but most of the time they are watching something and thinking about how people how they are responding and how that person must feel too,
to elicit that response of emotional empathy.
And it's very interesting because what really some of this is showing is that there's a lot more affective empathy before they take the treatment than there is after.
Right. That's why, I thought it was so fascinating. Again, I'm almost like seeing it as a risk factor that if you have high emotional empathy or affective empathy, that can lead to struggles with major depression. And again, I think a lot of this has to do with the over-identification and lack of boundaries.
Right.
But when there's been treatment with either, normal treatment, but antidepressant treatment is one they brought up a lot, or even remission from the major depression, that they actually decrease their emotional empathy and have higher cognitive empathy.
Right.
Which is interesting.
And we're talking about different parts of the brain here, right? So it's almost like it brings that prefrontal cortex online.
Yeah.
And they are able, and this does not mean that they don't have any affective empathy. They just have lower levels. So now it's like the affective empathy now can move into, now what can I do about this?
And that's what I think is interesting, because they really talked a lot about the use of antidepressants in here. And not to negate their results in this study, but I have heard so many of my patients who will be on their antidepressant, their depression gets better, but they actually report feeling a little numb. But they're better.
Right.
And so I'm almost wondering if antidepressants almost kind of dampen a little bit of what is going on emotionally with that emotional empathy, to enable them to almost have better boundaries to have cognitive empathy.
Yeah, and I almost wonder too, because I've heard the same thing from clients of mine, friends of mine that have taken these types of medications, that I wonder too if it allows, I kind of think of this sometimes as like the fog of emotions.
Yes.
Like there's so much emotionality happening within the person that they like can't get to, okay, what can I do about this?
Right.
If it almost decreases that fog so that they can actually see a pathway forward.
Yeah.
And I think this would be very, very interesting to show, not just with like different pain points, but what about excitement, like different emotionality that way? Would
Interesting.
it dampen those types of emotions as well? Like we're talking negative emotions,
Right.
like depression and
Right.
sadness and fear and things like that. But I wonder too, would that also dampen the excitement and joy and happiness and things like that as
I
well?
do know a lot of people who really struggle with antidepressants, of like they don't know if they want to stay on it or not. A lot of my patients have said it does actually dampen their joy and that they feel numb. But I'm wondering in here, because they don't address that in this study,
Right.
but I do think it is interesting to see how treatment, whether it's antidepressant, whether it's brain stimulation, whether it's psychotherapy, they don't get into the differential effects, but it is interesting that it definitely does seem to do something to that very intense negative frame of mind that is being manifested through empathy.
Yeah. And it's interesting too, and I would have liked to have seen, okay, what's the difference between like medication or brain stimulation or psychotherapy?
Right.
Like maybe there is a differentiation between, okay, in brain stimulation or in medication, we're seeing a reduction in all emotions.
Right.
But in psychotherapy, they can still feel those happy emotions,
good
so
emotions,
positive emotions, but is able to dampen the negative ones.
Well, and the other thing I'm now thinking also with regards to this study is which comes first? It's kind of a chicken or the egg. Do they have heightened emotional or affective empathy, and that's what's leading to the depression? Or does the depression color their empathy and that they become more negatively empathic?
That is a really good question because they don't address that at all.
No.
And I think that would be a very interesting study to determine, is it because I am empathetic, I therefore move into these negative emotions easier?
Right.
Or is it because I am depressed, now I empathize more with the negative emotions than with the positive ones?
Well, and I keep thinking about the empaths in the world who just are so highly empathic with other people, and how, again, this is my practice, my little world, I see a lot of them as personality disordered, and that their emotional empathy doesn't really change, but they can go in and out of major depressive episodes, and that the empathy still seems to stay the same. So I guess when I'm thinking of my patients, it's almost like that might impact their depression, but it doesn't ever really go away with medication, and it's very difficult through therapy to have to work with them on better emotion regulation and a lot of other things to help them manage that better, working on boundaries and not taking everybody's stuff on.
Right. And I think that's one of the reasons why at the beginning of the article they talk about how this is a risky strength or a double-edged sword, because being empathetic is a wonderful thing. And please hear us when we say that, because both of us are
very empathic.
But I also think that we too have to remember that this is our go-to. This is what we tend to move towards, and be aware of that. Like I said, bringing up the example of me over-identifying with my client, right? We can over-identify with people that we are around.
Right. And that can lead to feeling chronically bad and potentially major depressive disorder.
Right. Or it could lead to positive stuff because it depends on who you put yourself around. But I think one of the things that we have to remember is, and you talked about it, is those boundaries.
Right.
And boundaries are hard. Sometimes.
I just taught boundaries last night
in
my class. They are.
They are.
I think you need to have good internal boundaries in order to have that cognitive empathy.
Explain what do you mean by internal boundaries?
Of being able to be self-contained and know who I am, know what I'm thinking, know what I'm feeling, and that our boundaries kind of drop when we don't have those things and we are looking for those answers out in the world. So it's like, if I don't feel good about myself, I'm going to be like, Mercy, am I okay? Am I okay? Am I okay?
Right.
And my boundaries are going to be down, which can be risky, because what if you say, Shannae, I'm sorry, but you're not okay? I then could completely go into a shame spiral and internalize it and plummet. And that's where I think people who tend to be more empathic, if it's coming through maybe a temperamental trait, they may struggle with developing those boundaries because just innately they're so connected to the pain in the world that it just almost like bleeds onto them.
Right.
And they can't almost like shake it off of them.
Right. And I think that this is very interesting when we're talking about the Christian faith, that when we really internalize, that relationship that we have with God, and God is the one who makes those decisions for us. We're not looking at it out here, but we're looking at it up here for who are we? Who should we be? How should I respond to this? That then, therefore, I can have that internal boundary because now I have seen it, in scripture and teaching and stuff like that, and I can internalize it. And so therefore, out here, I can not only be empathetic out here, but I can also keep that cognitive part of me online and say, okay, yes, I feel with this person, I feel for this person, but now what can I do to help this person, because they need to help too, and they need to figure that out too.
You just explained my life. Or you just really explained a lot of my sanctification with the Lord. That really, when I came to the Lord, because I was such a people pleaser, my boundaries were so porous, I was taking on everybody's stuff, couldn't say no, was just being defined by everybody and what they thought of me. And when I really learned, Shannae, it doesn't really matter. That I have an audience of one, and it's what God tells me, that now with my boundaries and being highly empathic, I can really rest and just kind of almost go, Lord, what do you want me to do with the feelings that I'm having about this? And sometimes the Holy Spirit will be just like, Shannae, pull back a little bit. Because I used to have so much shame about how empathic I was and how emotional I was. And God really kind of said, Shannae, this is really your superpower. This is really, I've given you a gift to be able to assess and feel things that other people don't. And so you can only do that, though, when you're connected to me, when you have your boundaries, and you're not picking up all this excess static. I can then really attune to what is going on with my patients, what's going on with my friends, because I'm resting in Him and I'm not worried about everything else that's going on.
Right, and I think that's very interesting because us as clinicians, we are taught attunement, but not always are we taught this
to pull back.
This internal boundary as well of when we are attuning too much. And I think that's wonderful that God taught you that. And I think it's wonderful too that we can see that even in scripture with Jesus. He was there, he felt with people. I think he was extremely empathic. I mean,
But he could say no.
He could say no.
And he sometimes turned people away.
Yeah, and sometimes, he cried. It was interesting. The story that came to my mind is the story of Lazarus, where, Jesus knew what was going to happen. Jesus already knew he was going to die.
And he loved Lazarus.
And he got there and he cried. And I don't think he cried for himself because he knew what he was going to do. Right? But he cried for the people and understanding how broken this world really is and how difficult death is. Because we don't really see Jesus dealing with that. Well, we do see it a little bit with the death of his cousin. John the Baptist. So we do see it a little bit, but here it's his friend. It's a close confidant for him, and we see him being empathetic to everybody else, feeling with them. But then he allowed that empathy to do something.
Right. And that's where I would bet he had both the emotional empathy and the cognitive empathy. He didn't kind of nosedive into, oh my gosh, Lazarus is dead and I'm going to decompensate and become depressed and not get out of bed.
Right.
But he was able to hold it together, grieve, and then also act on it
Mhm.
because he understood what other people were experiencing from a cognitive perspective.
Right.
And I think that's really where we want to be, because we can fall too far, I think, almost in both ends.
Exactly. I was just about to say that.
Yeah,
Yes.
of being too empathic, over identifying, plummeting potentially into a major depressive disorder, or being kind of cold and shut down and not letting anything affect you.
Right. And I think that's where, I love that Jesus gave this really great balance.
Yes.
And that is one of the things that we really came out of this is balance. That's really the important thing, is that being empathetic is a wonderful thing, but it can also be a detriment if you don't guard that strength.
Yes.
So I hope you enjoyed this video. Please give us a like, or if you would like to subscribe to our channel to see more videos of us, please do so. Also, give us a comment if you have any questions, or if you have any suggestions for future videos. We'd love to hear from you. And guess what? We'll see you next time.